For decades, Joe Jackson was called the most hated father in music history. The man who beat his children, the man who stole their childhood, the man who turned Michael Jackson into a tortured genius. That's the story the world knows. But before Joe Jackson died in 2018, he gave a series of interviews that most people never saw. Interviews where he finally told his side of the story. And what he said, it's not what you'd expect. Because Joe Jackson didn't deny hitting his kids. He didn't apologize for being strict. He didn't beg for forgiveness. Instead, he said something that will make you question everything you thought you knew about Michael Jackson's childhood. By the end of this video, you'll understand why Joe Jackson believed he saved his children's lives, and why Michael, despite everything, never completely cut his father out of his life. To understand Joe Jackson's side, you need to understand where he came from. Joseph Walter Jackson was born in 1928 in Arkansas. His father abandoned the family when Joe was young. His mother struggled to keep food on the table. Joe grew up in extreme poverty during the Great Depression. He saw things, experienced things that shaped how he viewed the world. In the late 1940s, Joe moved to Gary, Indiana, looking for work. He got a job at a steel mill. Hard, dangerous work, long hours, low pay. In 1949, he married Catherine Scrouse. They started having children almost immediately. By the mid-1960s, Joe and Catherine had 9 children, living in a tiny 3-bedroom house in Gary, Indiana. Joe was working double shifts at the steel mill, barely making enough to feed his family. And here's what Joe said in one of his final interviews. "I looked at my life and I realized I'm going to die in that steel mill, and my sons are going to die in that steel mill, unless I find a way out." Music was that way out. Joe had been a musician himself. He played guitar in a local R&B band called the Falcons. They never made it big, but Joe understood the music business. And when he noticed his sons had talent, especially little Michael, Joe saw an opportunity, not just for them, for the entire family. Joe made a decision. He was going to turn his sons into stars, no matter what it took. And that's where the story gets complicated. Because Joe's methods were brutal. Everyone knows that. Michael talked about it. His brothers talked about it. The whole world knows Joe Jackson was a harsh disciplinarian. But here's what Joe said. "I wasn't trying to hurt my children. I was trying to save them." Save them from what? From poverty, from gangs, from drugs, from the steel mill, from the life Joe had lived. And in Joe's mind, the end justified the means. Joe Jackson ran rehearsals like a drill sergeant. After school, the Jackson brothers would come home and immediately start practicing. Hours and hours every single day. If they made a mistake, Joe would stop them, make them do it again, and again, and again. And if they kept making mistakes, Joe would discipline them. Michael Jackson described it in multiple interviews. He said his father would sit in a chair with a belt in his hand during rehearsals. If Michael missed a step, missed a note, wasn't sharp enough, Joe would use that belt. Michael also said he was so terrified of his father that he would sometimes vomit before performances. That's the image the world has of Joe Jackson, the abusive father, the monster. But here's what Joe said when confronted about this. "I did what I had to do. You think those rehearsals were hard? The music industry is 1,000 times harder. I was preparing them for reality." Joe pointed out that Gary, Indiana in the 1960s was a dangerous place. Gang violence, drug addiction, kids getting shot in the streets. Joe said, "I kept my boys busy. I kept them focused. I kept them out of trouble. How many of their friends from the neighborhood are dead or in prison? All of them. Every single one." And Joe wasn't exaggerating. The survival rate for young black men in Gary, Indiana during that era was terrifyingly low. Joe believed that by being strict, even brutal, he was giving his children a chance at life. But here's the question nobody wants to ask. Was he right? Because here's the uncomfortable truth. The Jackson 5 became one of the most successful groups in music history. Michael Jackson became the biggest star on the planet. Janet Jackson became a global icon. The Jackson family escaped poverty, They became wealthy beyond imagination. Did Joe's methods work? Michael would say no. He'd say the psychological damage wasn't worth it, that he lost his childhood, that he never forgave his father. But Joe would say yes. He'd say all 9 of his children survived. None of them ended up in prison. None of them ended up addicted to drugs as teenagers. None of them ended up dead in the streets of Gary. And in Joe's mind, that was success. Here's something most people don't know. Michael Jackson never completely cut his father out of his life. Even after all the interviews where Michael talked about his childhood trauma, even after Michael publicly said he was afraid of Joe, even after all of that, Michael still had a relationship with his father. Not a good relationship, not a close relationship, but a relationship. Joe attended Michael's concerts. He was at Neverland occasionally. He was present at family events. And Michael tolerated it. Why? Because Michael's feelings about his father were complicated. In a 1993 interview with Oprah Winfrey, Michael was asked about Joe. He said, "There's been times when he's come over to my house and I've had to ask him to leave, but I do love him. I do love him. Not I did love him, present tense." Despite everything, Michael still loved his father. In 2003, during the Martin Bashir documentary, Michael was asked if he'd let his own children spend time with Joe. Michael paused, thought about it, and said, "With supervision." He didn't say no. He said with supervision. That tells you everything about Michael's complicated relationship with his father. He recognized that Joe had damaged him, but he also recognized that Joe had given him opportunities. He hated his father's methods, but he couldn't deny the results. And here's what Joe said about this. "Michael knew I did what I had to do. He might not have liked it, but he understood it." Did Michael understand it? Maybe. Or maybe Joe just told himself that to feel better. But there's evidence that Michael's feelings were genuinely conflicted. In his later years, Michael would sometimes defend his father publicly. When journalists called Joe abusive, Michael would say things like, "He was strict, yes, but he cared about us." When people said Joe was only interested in money, Michael would point out that Joe worked at the steel mill while managing the Jackson 5 for years. He didn't quit his day job until the group was already successful. Michael once said in an interview, "People don't understand what my father was up against. A black man with 9 children trying to break into the music industry in the 1,960 seconds. He had to be tough." So which version of Michael's feelings is true? The Michael who said he was terrified of Joe? Or the Michael who defended Joe? The answer is both. Michael Jackson spent his entire life trying to reconcile his love for his father with his trauma from his father. And he never fully succeeded. In 1993, Michael Jackson was accused of child molestation for the first time. The allegations nearly destroyed Michael's career, his reputation, his life. And Joe Jackson? He stood by his son. Publicly, Joe defended Michael. He called the allegations false. He said his son was being extorted. But privately, Joe was reportedly furious. Not because he believed the allegations. Joe always maintained Michael was innocent, but because of how Michael's lifestyle had made him vulnerable. Joe had warned Michael for years about surrounding himself with children, about being too trusting, about letting people take advantage of him. In a 2013 interview, Joe said, "I told Michael, you're too nice, too soft. The world is going to eat you alive." And I was right. Joe believed that Michael's personality, his gentleness, his childlike nature, his desperate desire to recapture his lost childhood made him a target. And Joe blamed himself for that. In one of his final interviews, Joe said, "Maybe I was too hard on him. Maybe that's why he tried to escape into childhood later. I don't know, but I was trying to make him strong. I was trying to make him strong." That's the tragedy of Joe Jackson. He genuinely believed he was helping his children by being harsh with them. He thought discipline equaled strength. He thought fear equaled respect. He thought if he could just push them hard enough, they'd be unstoppable. And in some ways, he was right. Michael Jackson was incredibly disciplined, incredibly professional, incredibly driven, but he was also incredibly damaged. Joe gave Michael the tools to become the king of pop, but he also gave Michael the trauma that would haunt him forever. And Joe, in his final years, seemed to struggle with that realization. In a 2017 interview just a year before his death, Joe was asked if he had any regrets about how he raised his children. Joe paused, looked away, and said, "I did what I thought was right at the time. If I had to do it over again, I don't know. Maybe I'd do things differently, maybe not." That's as close to an apology as Joe Jackson ever gave. Not a full apology, not "I'm sorry," just "maybe I do things differently." For some people, that's not enough. For others, it's all you can expect from a man like Joe Jackson, a man shaped by poverty, by racism, by desperation, a man who genuinely believed the ends justified the means. But here's the question: do they? Here's something that might surprise you. Joe Jackson died with almost no money. The man who managed the Jackson 5, the man who helped create Michael Jackson's career, the man who, according to popular belief, exploited his children for decades. He died nearly broke. How is that possible? Because Joe Jackson lost control of his children's careers early on. In the mid-1970s, when the Jackson 5 left Motown and signed with Epic Records, they also left Joe's management. Michael, in particular, wanted distance from his father professionally. He hired other managers, other advisors, other handlers. Joe was essentially cut out of Michael's career by the time Off the Wall came out in 1979. He didn't manage Thriller. He didn't manage Bad. He didn't manage any of Michael's solo work. So, the narrative that Joe Jackson spent decades profiting off Michael's success, it's not accurate. Joe made money in the early years, the Jackson 5 days. But by the time Michael became a global superstar, Joe was on the outside looking in. And this haunted Joe for the rest of his life. In interviews, Joe would talk about how he built the foundation of Michael's career, how he was the one who discovered Michael's talent, how he was the one who trained him, disciplined him, pushed him. And then, once Michael was successful, Joe was cast aside. From Joe's perspective, this was the ultimate betrayal. He had sacrificed everything, his own music, career, his time, his relationship with his children, to make them stars. And his reward was being labeled an abuser, a monster, a man who exploited his children. In a 2009 interview, shortly after Michael's death, Joe said, "I gave that boy the world, and he turned his back on me." But here's the other side of that story. Michael gave Joe opportunities to be part of his life. Michael invited Joe to events. He provided financial support when needed. He never completely cut Joe off. But Michael also set boundaries. He didn't want Joe managing his career. He didn't want Joe controlling his money. He didn't want to give Joe the power Joe once had over him. And Joe resented that. Joe wanted recognition. He wanted credit. He wanted the world to acknowledge that without Joe Jackson, there would be no Michael Jackson. And he was right about that. But Joe also wanted Michael to forget the trauma, to move past it, to just be grateful. And Michael couldn't do that. So they existed in this painful middle ground where Joe felt unappreciated and Michael felt unhealed. Neither of them could give the other what they needed. June 25th, 2009, Michael Jackson dies. Joe Jackson rushes to the hospital, but he's too late. Michael is already gone. And here's the heartbreaking part. Joe and Michael never had a final conversation. No reconciliation, no moment of understanding, no closure, just silence. In the days after Michael's death, Joe appeared on television multiple times, and people were shocked by what they saw. Joe didn't seem emotional. He didn't cry. He didn't talk about his grief. Instead, he talked about business, about Michael's legacy, about the family's plans. At one point, Joe even promoted a new record label he was starting. The public was appalled. They saw Joe as a heartless monster who was exploiting his son even in death. But here's what people didn't understand. That was Joe's way of coping. Joe Jackson didn't know how to express emotion. He didn't know how to be vulnerable. He only knew how to be the manager, the businessman, the provider. Even in grief, Joe reverted to the only role he knew. Years later, Joe's daughter Janet talked about this. She said, "People don't understand my father. He shows love through action, not words. He doesn't know how to say, 'I love you,' but he shows it in other ways." But did Michael know that? Did Michael understand that Joe's harsh discipline was Joe's twisted version of love? We'll never know, because they never had that conversation. In 2018, Joe Jackson died. He was 89 years old. His last years were difficult. He'd had a stroke. His health was declining. His finances were a mess. And according to people close to the family, Joe spent his final years thinking about Michael, wondering if he'd done the right thing, wondering if Michael had ever forgiven him, wondering if, in the end, it was all worth it. Joe Jackson never got the redemption arc he wanted. He never got to sit down with Michael and hash it all out. He never got to say, "I'm sorry," or hear, "I forgive you." He just died. And Michael had been dead for 9 years by that point. So there was no reconciliation, no Hollywood ending, no moment where father and son finally understood each other. Just two men, one living, one dead, both carrying wounds that never healed. Joe Jackson's side of the story doesn't make him a hero, but it doesn't make him a simple villain either. It makes him human, flawed, complicated, damaged by his own past, trying to do what he thought was right and causing immense harm in the process. So how should we remember Joe Jackson? As the man who created the Jackson 5 or the man who traumatized Michael Jackson? The answer is both. Joe Jackson's legacy is inseparable from Michael Jackson's legacy. You can't celebrate one without acknowledging the other. Michael became the king of pop because of his talent, yes, but also because of the discipline Joe instilled in him, the work ethic, the perfectionism, the drive to be the best. Those traits came from Joe, but so did Michael's fear, his anxiety, his inability to trust people, his desperate need to be loved, his retreat into childhood. Those traits also came from Joe. Joe Jackson gave his son the tools to conquer the world, but he also gave him the wounds that made living in that world unbearable. And Joe, to his dying day, never fully understood that. He understood that Michael was hurt, but he didn't understand why Michael couldn't just move past it. In Joe's mind, the success should have been enough. The wealth, the fame, the achievement that should have made everything worth it. But Michael needed something Joe couldn't give him. An acknowledgement that the methods were wrong, that the abuse was real, that the trauma mattered. Joe couldn't do that, because to admit his methods were wrong would be to admit his entire life philosophy was wrong. And Joe Jackson was not a man who admitted he was wrong. So they stayed locked in their positions. Michael, the wounded son who couldn't forgive. Joe, the unrepentant father who couldn't apologize. Two men who loved each other but couldn't reach each other. And now they're both gone. The only thing left is the music, the legacy, the Jackson family's incredible contribution to music history. Was it worth it? You'll have to answer that for yourself. Joe Jackson told his side of the story. Now, you've heard it. He wasn't the villain he was made out to be, but he wasn't the hero he believed he was either. He was a complicated man who made brutal choices in desperate circumstances. And those choices created the greatest entertainer the world has ever seen. But at what cost? If this deep dive into Joe Jackson's perspective opened your eyes to the complexity of Michael's story, subscribe to King of POP and hit that notification bell. We've got more untold stories from Michael's life coming your way. And let us know in the comments. Do you think Joe Jackson's methods were justified, or was the cost too high? Stay tuned for more content. Long live the King of Pop.